that have come up throughout. And we'll definitely want to use the mic so everybody in the back can hear, so if you can wait for me to run around.
I have two questions. The first is, if you get even two scientists in the room, you can have dramatically different points of view. Can the whole panel talk a little bit about the scientific process and how the ALS community shares information and mediates concepts and tests hypotheses? Are there forums? Are there papers? Or is there a process to duplicate effort in terms of looking at these theories?
Talk to us. So email us, if you have questions about.
So are there ALS conferences where people share?
Absolutely,
yeah.
For sure, yeah. So at that sort of high scientific level, and also advocate groups, talk to your Congress people to sort of increase funding for research as a whole, all sorts of avenues, I would say.
Yeah, I go to many ALS conferences over the years, and I think what I wanted to emphasize is the complexity of this. And so in my overview, I skimmed over a lot of things that may have resulted in us sounding different. But because the areas are so complex, and so when we get into talking about some of these models, every model has its problem. And so I advocated the pluripotent stem cells, and they have problems as well. But there's a lot of conversation going back and forth among scientists and clinicians about how to monitor these things.
So if you just dance around and try to be polite, you really don't make progress. So in fact, there's a lot of arguments that go into this. And pluripotent stem cells are all the rage. And so is, and I'm one of the ones that's saying, damn it, I've been working for 20 years on motor neurons. We have all this data, and you guys haven't characterized it even a tenth of the extent that we have, and you're not even paying any attention to these papers. That's part of it, because there's, to be honest, a major part of science these days is advertising and getting it across into a high-profile journal so that some study section will pay attention to it so you can keep funding. And the funding is so tight that really it's really hurting any sort of innovation, as well as taking a left, looking out and looking at fruit flies. There actually is interest in doing that, but I think you saw the huge potential. Try to do that in mouse, and we're talking about another 100 years to get to where he's at. But knowing his gene and the fact that a fruit fly really isn't that different than a mouse, and a mouse isn't that different than a human, that you can actually pinpoint and figure out where things are occurring. So the debate and the controversy is very healthy. A lot of things you've been hearing about, they've been going on for 20 years, but the tools are so much better. And then there's the old proverb of, going around and looking at an elephant and everybody, blind men, feeling it, and which part of it are. Well, we're looking at a very huge elephant, and frankly, I'm hoping that I have the trunk and I'm not under the other end that's about to dump. Okay, but that's part of the complexity of it.
Great. My other question is, it's been shared with me that to go from the lab bench to like an approved therapy can be 15 years and close to $1 billion. For you guys who are the bench researchers, what does it take for you to take the leap to move something into translational research to become a testable therapy? And then as a clinician, Dr. Goslin, how do you put your energy and decide what things that the clinical community really want to put their energy in?
I want to hear her answer first.
It's a hard thing. I think there are there are increasing numbers of trials in ALS, and there's a limited number that we can do at our center. And so at our center, we often get access to almost many of the trials other than stem cells, which are so restricted at this point. And so talking to ALS colleagues, like I interact with a lot of other ALS clinicians to get the sense of what makes the most practical scientific sense. And so I choose trials based on that. But it's very complicated.
And certainly for me, once we have identified several targets in fruit flies, we certainly would hope to go into mice, and then once we can do preclinical trials in mice, then it would go, hopefully somebody will be able to pick it up to do clinical trials. But it's just that step, those stages to go. And unfortunately, the only answer is more money. Obviously, that has to be spent wisely, but as Dr. Beckman was saying, the problem, I think, for an awful lot of senior scientists is that we're spending most of our time writing grants, not actually doing the science. And how we really overcome that, it's a very complicated problem.
So I, again, am the blind man trying to figure out how to go, because I think we've been through the preclinical models and we have, right now really promising data on a compound. I think we can move forward. And then you start to realize why it's mountains of paperwork. The drug that you're talking about, it's the same amount of paperwork. Someone has to make the drug and do that. And each step, and you talk about the cost of doing this, the costs are very real. And it's not just writing grants, it's the complete risk adversity that, there are going to be complications, and, how can you identify them and figure out, how do you solve all these questions? And there's hundreds of them that I'm busy sitting now trying to think, I have no idea how to get around this, or, what's the right way to do it? Or, I don't want to spend 3 more years doing some experiment over again just for a regulatory body. Because I'm dead as a scientist if I try to solve the questions that the FDA is going to be asking. On the other side of it is, it's not billions of dollars now to develop a drug for an orphan disease. The FDA has really changed its rules around. There's a lot of different support mechanisms. The ALS Association and other people are working really hard to work with people that have these new ideas and trying to develop things faster. And even the way that we approach clinical studies is changing rapidly, that the placebo-controlled double-blinded trial is considered the gold standard, but really we can look at more things like adaptive Bayesian trials and lots of other methodologies that can get us there faster and hopefully prioritize which drug to work with first. And Dr. Goslin, mine first.
Okay, any other questions out there? Yes, I knew this table would be rich in questions.
So the United States is not the only country that's trying and funding research in ALS, both at the clinical and at the model level. So the European community obviously is doing the same thing. So is their regulatory environment worse or better than the U.S.? And what kind of, communication and synergy is there between the two communities?
I certainly can't address the regulatory side of things, but in terms of communication and collaboration, I think science generally is very broadly open, and lots of international meetings and stuff where ideas are put back and forth all the time. So at the basic science level, absolutely.
And what about at the funding level? Because that's where, a lot of the money comes from basic research. So, and there are lots of other diseases that compete for funding. And so in the United States, we have a very active ALS association that, lobbies, if you will, in a good sense for funding for ALS. I was wondering how this plays out, or in other countries as well, so that we in the United States can take advantage of the things that are happening in the rest of the world.
So there is a lot of interplay. Like one of the drugs that she was talking about is developed by a French pharmaceutical company for treating IL-3. And I was involved in testing some of those with my friend in Uruguay. So there's a lot of moving back and forth. The FDA will take clinical trials and consider those that are done in Europe, but they also have to be done here and meet their own regulatory requirements. The same is true if you take a drug and take it to Europe. They're going to want to have their own standards, and their elements of risk are different. And so some drugs will be approved there but not be approved here. But that also is a really complex thing. And but the other thing to remember is ALS actually does pretty well in funding. People know it's a bad disease. They want to find it. They're looking for ideas. There's a lot of support. And the hope that's come, the discovery of SOD mutations 20 years ago, transformed the field because we have a real animal model, the most utilized animal model for neurodegeneration anywhere in the world. The problem is nothing's really worked in it after 20 years, so people start to give up hope. And that's really the key thing, is actually 20 years is not that long. We're starting to break through it. Look what they spent to get the Higgs boson and how long they worked on it.
Okay. Is there another question over here?
That was my question.
Okay. Okay. Looking around the room, are there other questions? So one question I had probably for Dr. Goslin is, how do you get somebody, if they're interested in a clinical trial, what's the process of engaging in actually becoming a part of a trial?
Well, it's fairly easy if you're a patient at Providence, in terms of one of the initial things in the initial discussions is, are you interested in research? And so there's a mechanism of getting onto our research list. So we don't do all of the clinical trials, and so one of the things I try to assess is whether someone has the means and interest in traveling to other sites. I tend to stay pretty up on what's going on in terms of the clinical trials, so I can certainly help in terms of trying to let you be aware of clinical trials that look very promising elsewhere. And I think that applies to people who are not Providence patients. Is you could just call and talk to my research coordinator and just make us aware of your interests, and we can use the same mechanisms in that regard.
Yes.
Actually, this is a question for Joe. You talk about the slow pace of progress with some of the time it takes to do this work, but you've shared with me many times. I'm wondering if you could reflect about the changes you've seen in the clinical management and what that means. Because you're a basic scientist, but I just want to share that Joe's been a huge proponent around the clinical management side of things as well.
So I get a lot of emails and a lot of questions from people that are desperate. My mom was just diagnosed. I've just been diagnosed. And, is there anything you can do? Are you doing any treatments? And a wide range of things. And, it's like, I have a PhD in pine trees, okay? But the truth is that there's been huge progress in the management of the disease. And it's people like Kim that are willing to do that I think have made a real difference in how the disease progresses. And it's a real thing. So she mentioned, for example, the high-fat diet. Well, I've gotten very studied reviews back from someone saying, well, the New England Journal teaches us that there is not a problem with nutrition in ALS patients. It was like, come on, jackass. I got that from the New England Journal 3 months ago. Sorry, I have anger issues these days. But there are a lot of opinions that are, are much more firmly established, I think, than the facts really dictate. But there is this whole thing of, what do you do? So a lot of patients come in and they say, I should go on a really healthy diet. And, I'm at the Linus Pauling Institute, what vitamins should I take? And, should I go lose weight? And so, no, eat ice cream. You want the fats. Your mitochondria don't work as well, okay? I would say one thing that I would recommend that wasn't mentioned is vitamin E. Lou Gehrig took vitamin E. Clearly, it doesn't work on patients. But what it does do is people that are taking it for years beforehand and have higher levels in the brain, the incidence of developing Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's are reduced by 50 to 60%. It's not a kind of thing you could do a clinical trial to prove. And then if you're doing it, the other problem is people don't really pay attention to how do you take vitamin E. Take it with food. It's fat. You need to have food for the body to absorb it. If you do it like most Americans with a low-fat diet and coffee at breakfast, you're feeding it bacteria in your gut. And there's lots of controversies about vitamin E. It's going to kill you. And that's a matter of really bad statistics. But that's a whole nother lecture. But, to me, it makes sense. If your brain is a mixture of butter and fish oil, and you know what happens if you leave a fish sit out on the bench as it goes rancid, and vitamin E prevents lipids from going rancid. It takes years to build it up in the brain, and the spinal cord is the hardest tissue to get anything into. And so, take a vitamin E pill at night, and don't obsess about it. But there actually is a concordance of people with one patient or one person developing ALS. It's higher in those families. So why not take vitamin E? But I think I got off topic a bit, but I do that a lot. I think there's a lot that can be done with management with the disease. I think that the clinical trials, they fail for 1,000 reasons that have nothing to do whether or not the drug works or not. But it's the wrong dose, the wrong time, the wrong routes, or you're not getting it early enough. And the other part is this is a massive assault on many parts of the system. And just because you stop one feint of an attack here doesn't mean that the other things overwhelm it. So a key part of this is we have to keep in mind that there are a lot of different things going on, and understand that as scientists, we're terrible at understanding how to do 2 drugs at once, okay? And how do you do the multiple therapy? And that's where this double-blinded, placebo-controlled standard isn't going to get us to where we need to be. You really need to be more flexible in managing the disease. And it's obvious it works, that people do better on average than they did before. And we're going to do better.
Amy.
As scientists, I feel like you guys you're constantly in the realm of the background science that's going on associated with ALS. From the patient side, there is a certain amount of desperation. There's a lot of desperation, and you just cling on to the first study or story that you hear on the web. Is there a suggested literature source that you would recommend if we want to stay in touch and up to date with the more scientific discoveries of ALS, or even with brain disease? Can you suggest something for layman's?
Well, there are several websites that go through the available clinical trials. Like the ALS Association website has a section that talks about available trials. It doesn't. The difficulty is it doesn't describe, as much the rationale behind it, and so that's sort of hard to get at. I don't know any aside from interacting with clinicians who are involved in it, I don't know any other particular source, and maybe you do.
I would share that, particularly for everyone here who's living with ALS, if you sign up to the ALS registry, the National ALS Registry, they've implemented a really good module that alerts people around clinical trials. And I'm also really excited to share that in June, they're releasing the first reports from the ALS registry. A number of papers are coming out around the demographics and the numbers of people the registry have identified. And they're working on numbers of papers. So pretty much from June through the end of this year, there's going to be a lot of ALS news about environmental aspects of the disease, which is really exciting. But the other piece that I would recommend, particularly when it's looking at alternative therapies, there's an excellent website called ALS Untangled, which uses a great volunteer crew of people with scientific backgrounds who really look at and investigate alternative therapies for their rationale, try to debunk what's myths, but also really say some of these things deserve a much closer look if they're beneficial.
And certainly in terms of recent basic science breakthroughs, I think the ALS Association, Lucy Bruin does a fantastic job of getting information out on you've seen there are a number of pamphlets that are out, but I think it's monthly that they put out that really describe, you know, TDP43, when it was first came out, she pushed that, the C97 off, whichever that gene is, which is incredibly cool biology, but she again put that out very quickly. So as basic science gets published, if it's to do with ALS, I think she's very good at putting that information out very quickly.
We've got another suggestion here.
So if anyone participated in the Drink One for Dane Dutch Brothers fundraiser last week, a friend of mine asked me, and she said, well, she was really confused why some of the literature and the funding said the Muscular Dystrophy Association when it was an ALS fundraiser. So I went to the MDA website, and they have some amazing, amazing tabs on there for research and just anything that's in the news about ALS and any sort of brain diseases, because they're so connected. And it's not just Jerry's kids anymore. The MDA website was really, really helpful.
Thank you. Did you have other things to say up there? I wanted to make sure. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question about the exercise component. I'm a physical therapist, so I'm curious. Obviously, or I would assume that that is being prescribed potentially in patients who are very newly diagnosed, not having a lot of more advanced symptoms. But also then in terms of, because it is such a hypermetabolic disease, obviously having to increase calorie intake and balance that, because if you're starting to burn more calories through a moderate level of exercise, then obviously the weight loss concern could become more of an issue. And I'm assuming that when they come in, maybe getting some of their initial diagnoses, you're working with them on educating them that. I think it's pretty prevalent, at least a thought process in the therapy community, that you don't exercise these folks because you don't want to burn them out any faster. So this was really interesting to me to hear this. So just if you can just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, most of the trials are looking at fairly early stages. And you know, the standard is what you're talking about, that you, no matter what, the bottom line is getting enough calories. So that's always taken into account, and you have to compensate for that. The other aspect of it is compensating for respiratory status. And so there may be ways of, and the other aspect is moderate varies throughout the course of the disease, and so you can adjust. So trying to figure out mechanisms of determining what moderate exercise is. But in more advanced stages, if you decrease the level and compensate for the respiratory status with like AVAPs or BiPAP, it may still enable some degree of, but it does change as the disease progresses.
Great, thank you. Okay, so if there are no further questions today, I would like to thank our panel, thank the three of you very much. So part of our mission, as Lance talked about, as the ALS Association, is to help to redefine what hope means sometimes for families living with ALS. As Amy said, there's a level of desperation that we hope to try to alleviate by talking about symptom management and quality of life types of issues. How can you live fully with ALS? But sometimes it's inspiring to take a moment to really listen to what's happening in the research community, because that goes back to sort of the classic interpretation of hope, which is looking forward to a cure and a treatment for ALS. So thank you for being part of that today and for providing all of us in the room with inspiration and with hope. I do hope that you'll stay and talk and eat a little bit outside, and thank you all for being here.
It's just